I have to say it's really wonderful to see so many old friends and familiar faces in the crowd. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Stuart Buys, and I'm a member of the board of the James Merrill House program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening, and to introduce our speaker. Before I do, I would like to thank the LaGrua Center for co-sponsoring this event and for all this that the center does for the Merrill House program and the Borough of Stonington in general. In my search of the biography we celebrate today, I did not find any mention of Maury or Winnie LaGrua, or of the old foundry building we are in now. But as part of a glowing description of the Stonington first encounter by James Merrill and David Jackson in 1954, the biographer mentions that the children and grandchildren of Portuguese sailors formed the town's fishing fleet or went to work in its factories, the Velvet Mill across the railroad tracks, or the hulking plastics plant on Water Street. That plastics plant has had several incarnations since 1954, but a shiny new version of the red brick building Merrill News surrounds us today. I never met James Merrill, and I cannot imagine what he would say about what has happened to the plastics plant. But if he knew what had become of this building, the one we now call the LaGrua Center, my guess is that he would approve. He, like the LaGruas, bequeathed the people of Stonington a great gift, his home, which is now the site of the James Merrill House Museum and the James Merrill House Writer-in-Residence program. He, like the LaGruas, was remarkably generous, quietly giving financial support to many writers, artists, and friends. And now these two nonprofit organizations are making vibrant contributions to the town their benefactors loved. To continue the work they do, both organizations need the financial support of what NPR calls people like you. So if you have given in the past, thank you. Please do it again. If you have not given before, please consider giving now. I also want to thank Bank Square Books of Mystic for being here to offer copies of James Merrill Life and Art there in the back. Bank Square is one of the best independent bookstores you'll find anywhere, and it's very important that we support them as often as possible. You can start tonight. Many people have been waiting a long time for this book to arrive. Perhaps most of all, the author himself. But also, I imagine, his wife, his publisher, members of the Merrill family, many of whom are here tonight, and Merrill scholars and fans throughout the world. But I venture to say that somewhere high on that list of anxious anticipators should be a spot for the people of Stonington, and especially the extended family of the James Merrill House program. There are people in this room who knew James Merrill as a citizen of Stonington, but may not have understood the enormous scope of his life and achievements. Many others here and throughout the world fell in love with Merrill's poetry while knowing very little about the man behind it. Now these gaps have been filled, and everyone can get a much clearer picture of the man and his art. The book is special to us, but so is its author. Langdon Hammer, or Lanny, as we have come to call him, is a local boy. He was born in New Haven, and his family lived in a series of coastal and Connecticut river towns between there and Old Lyme. His education and professional history goes like this: Yale, Yale, Yale. Yale BA in English, Yale PhD in English, Yale faculty, and in quick order, tenured full professor at Yale. Lanny is one of Yale's rock star professors whose English 310 Modern Poetry course is offered as a MOOC, a massively open online course on the university website. By my accounting, Lanny has spent most of the period between 2005 and today as chair of the English department, a position he still holds. But his productivity has not been impaired by administrative duties. Prior to James Merrill Life and Art, Lanny wrote or edited 4 previous books. In addition, he has published scores of journal articles, book chapters, introductions, and even a few poems of his own. He is the poetry editor editor of American Scholar magazine and a frequent contributor to the New York Times Book Review. You might think that after completing a project like this, he would be ready to take a long nap. But his CV reveals that he is working on 3 other book projects, including a collection of Merrill's letters and a biography of Elizabeth Bishop. It would have been enough that Lanny has given us this remarkable book, but he, his wife Uta, and now their son Julian, whom you can hear a little bit, are frequent visitors to Stonington, and we've come to know him as a remarkably kind and generous contributor to our James Merrill House adventure. This is actually Lanny's 2nd James Merrill lecture. I believe he is the only person to be a repeat speaker, an honor just shy of being a repeat guest host on Saturday Night Live. In 2008, Lanny was a James Merrill House writer-in-residence, living in the Merrill apartment while working on the biography. As a community service, he organized a Merrill poetry seminar in the apartment, and I was one of a small group of local residents who had the unique experience of discussing Merrill's poems in Merrill's apartment while sitting at the milk glass table in the tower room with Merrill's biographer. Of course, many of the poems have links to Stonington and Merrill's life, and so Lanny was able to provide valuable background to poems such as The Broken Home, A Tendency, The Summer People, and Days of 1994. Lanny also spoke here at the LaGrua Center during a Merrill conference we organized some years ago and has supported the work of the Merrill House program in many other ways. We are very grateful for all that he has done and continues to do. I will say little about the book itself. I'll leave that to Lanny, and I have used up much of his time already. I will point out what many of you already know, that the book has received glowing reviews in the New Yorker, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. I also want to say that I believe the subtitle, Life and Art, is very fitting. Years ago, I masqueraded as an English major, and I read the Richard Ellman biography of James Joyce. I was told at the time it set a standard for literary biographies from that point forward, and I understood that the author was doing double duty. He was a scholar of Joyce's art, laying out the progress of the writer's development while outlining the particulars of Joyce's life in relation to that development. I believe this is precisely what Lanny has done with James Merrill, Life and Art. I'm not a Merrill scholar, but I believe this first biography of Merrill will also be the last for quite some time because it provides such rich material for both Merrill scholars and more casual readers interested in learning about one of America's finest poets. We are so happy that this biography has finally arrived, and happier still that its author is here to speak to us tonight. Please help me welcome Langdon.
I merely live to work. That's James Merrill replying to David Calstone. Merrill had been needling him about how slow a writer he was, Calstone. And Calstone, who was a professor of literature, defended himself. Some of us have to work for a living, you know, referring to how little time he had left over after teaching. Typical of Merrill to turn a cliche on its head. Typical of him to pack a serious statement into a quip. As his friend pointed out, he had no need to work. The wealth he was born to ensured that. But rather than freeing him from work, his money allowed him to devote himself to the work he wanted to do. It was a kind of work, the writing of poetry, that drew on and shaped the rest of his life, giving meaning and design, a tone and a style to everything he did. Poetry made me who I am, he commented on another occasion, slyly reversing the usual relation between maker and made. Merrill sounds in these remarks like Oscar Wilde, the subversive master of antithesis, for whom the self was not a natural fact, but material to be fashioned, like a work of art. He also sounds like his father, Charles Merrill, who made his fortune working very hard on Wall Street. Indeed, strange to say, Merrill resembled both of these self-made men. He created a version of Wilde's aesthetic lifestyle, updating the artist dandy's role for the late 20th century, and he brought to the project an intensity of industry that his father would have understood. That's the way the biography begins. Those are the first 3 paragraphs. Don't worry. Much as I would like to, I won't read the next 900 pages. I will read a little more of the book. I will read a few passages, chosen because they suggest what were for me some special pleasures or problems. And I'll give them some commentary, but before I do, and I promise to stop talking in about 40 minutes or so, and I hope that you'll have questions and comments, so please have those ready. Before I do, I want to stop and say thank you, and how what a special occasion this is for me. Stuart has already done this rather fully, but I'm going to do it again, or at least briefly. Thank you to you, the audience, and to the people of Stonington, and particularly the members past and present and future of the Merrill House Committee. A couple of days ago, my Merrill House newsletter came in the mail, and as perhaps you got yours too, and I was really impressed by just how many names there were there who had contributed to this organization. I thought about, as I reflected on this, just how impressive it was, how many people have been involved in this, and how many writers have been brought to this community, how many events, how many Merrill annual lectures there have been, etc. It's really a phenomenal level of literary and community activity that's grown out of 107 Water Street over the past really 20 years. I could get started naming you, and I guess I won't. Then I would just be reading my acknowledgments. But let me just say that James Merrill did not envision you. He didn't, I don't think, do a whole lot to help you even after giving his property to the Stonington Village Improvement Association. So what you have done is truly remarkable. And I think it would be astonishing to him, as well as profoundly gratifying, to see what you've done in his town, in his building, with his particular legacy, in which writing and a way of living mingle. That is to say nothing about what many of you have done for that book of mine. So just imagine how satisfying it is for me to get to present it to you and share it with you. Let me start by reading some paragraphs from that Stuart already plucked some lines from. They are completely redundant because you can go outside and get a better picture than I'm going to give you. But here's my love letter and thank you note to you. Stonington. Neither Merrill nor Jackson had heard of the seaside Connecticut town until January 1954. Not the best time of year to visit either, was it? When they paid a visit to a friend who was staying there. Jimmy and David were so charmed by the town that they began looking for a place of their own at once. They found one with 5 rooms and a view of the harbor on the 3rd floor of a creaking 3-story turn-of-the-century building on Water Street. In February, David began setting up a new apartment, talking to the by-the-hour workers, second-hand shops, plumbers, the fire chief, etc. That's David, I'm quoting. By April, he and Merrill had moved in, renting their handful of small rooms for $25 per month. They liked it so well they stayed on that first year all the way into December. They had discovered a place of great natural beauty. Set in the far southeastern corner of the state, the town is built on a point about a mile long and less than a half a mile wide. Fringed with wharves and moorings, it tapers to a finger of land reaching into Fisher's Island Sound. At the end of it are a small beach and a rocky shore. To the west is Stonington Harbor, sheltered by a breakwater. To the east is Little Narragansett Bay and Sandy Point, an island formed by the mighty 1938 hurricane. On the other side of the bay are the resort town of Watch Hill, Rhode Island, and the dunes of Napatree Point. Rather than open sea, the view to the south is of Latimer Light and Fisher's Island, New York, making this a three-state view. The sea surrounds the town. The long, low shapes of land on the horizon ring the sea, creating a natural theater. The scene is lit by the sun as it rises behind Watch Hill, climbs over the town, and drops beyond the harbor at dusk. Blue, gray, tan, violet, pink, the colors of the land and sea keep shifting. Behind the soundtrack of church clock, seabirds, bellboy, and foghorn, there is intense quiet. At night, the sky fills up with stars. So in 1954, and so today, right? There follow from the paragraphs about the factories and so on and other things. And then this. From their new address at 107 Water Street in the center of town, Jimmy and David had the necessaries close at hand: a post office, a used bookstore, a liquor store, a drugstore, and on the first floor of the building, an A&P market. There was no movie theater, and they never joined the yacht club. A walk to the point took about 20 minutes. There were interesting characters to meet, mainly summer people or retirees who had led mildly glamorous lives elsewhere. For instance, John Mason Brown, a theater critic, or elderly George Copeland, a pianist who had met Debussy and performed with Isadora Duncan and Maggie Tate. But the town was not an exciting cultural center, a province town or Taos. Stonington, David quipped, is chock full of celebrities of an order which makes it seem like a 5-cent chocolate bar studded with peanuts, as opposed to the 10-cent bar with almonds. I love this town, Merrill declared. On the road to New York, he and Jackson stopped in a New Canaan coffee shop, familiar from days when he and his mother lived there. What a difference, he reflected, to live in a small town where one's family doesn't live. In its far corner of Connecticut, more than 3 hours by car from Manhattan, Stonington felt safely remote from the world he came from, but not so cut off that he couldn't get back there quickly. Decades later, in his long Ouija board poem, The Changing Light at Sandover, Merrill describes the freedom they felt. Now, strangers in the village, did we even have a telephone? Who needed one? We had each other for communication, and all the rest. And all the rest is an offhand reference to their lovemaking, their afternoons spent swimming naked or wandering the shore on Sandy Point, and the deepening intimacy that came with those hours alone together. How pleasant these days have been, Merrill exclaimed in his journal, and what a joy David is. Those are not sentences that he wrote very often. Perhaps every pair of lovers creates a private world, but Merrill and Jackson had reason to feel they needed to hide. For gays and lesbians in America, this was the era of the closet. In 1953, newly elected President Eisenhower signed an executive order that authorized the firing of any federal employee determined to be homosexual. The order was a product of the Cold War culture of surveillance epitomized by Senator Joseph McCarthy's investigation of subversives, which focused on communists and homosexuals as threats to national security. Jimmy and David moved into 107 Water Street while America was transfixed by the Army Mccarthy Hearings. Televised between March and June 1954, Merrill and Jackson, fascinated, listened on the radio. These hearings brought 4 years of red baiting by McCarthy's Senate subcommittee to a climax by turning official scrutiny on the chief counsel, Roy Cohn, and McCarthy himself. That the hearings ended by shaming McCarthy didn't so much free the nation from the power he had wielded as demonstrate that he too could be investigated. Later that summer, the demon appeared in the flesh when David spotted, or so he claimed, the big-bellied senator in his swimsuit on the sidewalk in Watch Hill. David is not a wholly reliable witness, however. The oppressive political climate did not constrain their style at home. The apartment's 5 small rooms were whimsical. From the sitting room, Jimmy and David gazed out at the harbor through colored panes, purple, 2 blues, a yellow. Just adjacent was the tower room where they ate their meals. Built into a tower on the corner of the building, crowned by a witch's pointy cap in days gone by, the room was round beneath a pressed tin dome. David painted the room an outrageous watermelon red. Their wicker couch he made a lavish orchid purple. Jimmy tipped his head back and painted the dome white around peeling ornamental motifs of fleur-de-lis. Around the milk glass tabletop, they placed 4 high-back cane chairs painted lavender and pink. For the floor of the little bedroom, they chose Granny Smith apple green, and for the bedroom walls, robin's egg blue. If the 1950s were the age of the closet, and the man in the gray flannel suit, the title of Sloan Wilson's 1955 novel, symbolized middle-class America's anxious conformism, the third-floor apartment on Water Street was a vibrant protest. Now, in previous occasions, speaking in Stonington, I have talked to you about the Stonington clique, the so-called Surly Temple, as they called themselves, who included, besides Jimmy and David, Grace Stone and Eleanor Praney, and Robert and Isabel Morse. So I won't do that. I've also talked to you about another clique. That would be Jimmy and David and the spirits that they talked to on the Ouija board. Above all, their familiar spirit, Ephraim. I'll be ready to talk to you about that maybe when I finish today, but I won't go there again. Instead, what I'd like to do is actually, read my answer to one of the tougher questions that faced me in producing this book. When I started it, my marvelous editor, Deborah Garrison, said to me only one thing. You have to say what you think about The Changing Light at Sandover. Is it a mistake or a masterpiece? Now, all of you who have read it, how many people have read it? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, this is an unusual audience, I think. If you've read it, or if you've seen it on your shelf or a neighbor's shelf, it's not as big as my book, but it's big. It's big, and at any rate, you know why this is a question. My approach to talking about the book was to not worry about whether it was a masterpiece or not. That can be decided by someone else in a few centuries. But instead to approach it as I think Merrill and Jackson did, as a kind of adventure and exploit. I spent a lot of time paying attention to how they made this poem, but at the end of it, I try to summarize what it was all about, and I'll read from that piece of the book, and it will include some longish quotation from James Merrill, as well as some Ouija board. Sandover insists that language, that is the instrument of all its revelations, prevents any revelation from being final. Underlying this idea was a romantic theory of consciousness that would have satisfied Blake. For language, Merrill said in an interview, reconciling poetry and science, this is Merrill, language is the human medium. It doesn't exist except perhaps as vast mathematical or chemical formulas in the realm of, cosmic forces, elemental processes, which we then personify or tame, if you like, through the imagination. So in a sense, all these figures, all the spirits accessed on the Ouija board are our creations, or mankind's. The powers that they represent are real, as, say, gravity is real. But they'd be invisible, inconceivable, if they'd never passed through our heads and clothed themselves out of the costume box that they found there. How they appear depends on us, on the imaginer. And they would have to vary wildly from culture to culture, or even temperament to temperament. A process that Einstein could entertain as a formula might be described by an African witch doctor as a crocodile. What's tiresome is when people exclusively insist on the forms they've imagined. Those powers don't need churches in order to be sacred. What they need are fresh ways of being seen. And the Ouija board was his way of seeing them. Does the Ouija board embarrass you? His interviewer asked. His interviewer was J.D. McClatchy on that occasion. From what I've just said, you see how pompous I can get. The mechanics of the board, this absurd, flimsy contraption creaking along, serves wonderfully as a hedge against inflation. I think it does embarrass the sort of reader who can't bear to face the random or trivial elements that coalesce, among others, to produce an elevated thought. That doesn't bother me at all. So much then for no accident. If you've read the poem, you've spent hundreds of pages being taught that there's no accident in the world, that everything is ordered. No. In contrast to Dante's plan, which is structured by Thomas theology, Merrill's trilogy lacks any organizing system that's external to the language that generated it. It was open to accident and revision at every point. The whole that it constitutes is that of a poet's experience, the substance of revelation being its own volatile, magical means. The poem's story is the story of its making. But Sandover isn't only about the human medium language. It's also about love and friendship. It's about a shared life, about the way that a shared life takes shape and gathers meaning over time. It's about literary influence and the collective imagination we call culture. It's about frivolity and about grief. It's about gay identity and the masquerade of gender, about atomic fission and human generation, the will to die and the will to live. It's about the origins of the planet and its future, the dream of heaven and the dream of paradise. It's a grand, grand opera, a puppet show, a voodoo dance, a game of patience. When we close the big book and stand back, what emerges is Merrill's daring, the scope of his long poem, its constant, restless, technical invention, and its peculiarly, faintly scandalous premise. Or was that premise so peculiar? The revelations of Sandover were created by that fundamental commonplace activity, conversation. And revelation, the Ouija board emphasized, was no secret art. Here I'm quoting not the poem, but a Ouija transcript that I found. This is the spirit Ephraim talking to the mediums after it's all over. We lay no claim to omniscience, only to overview normal in high places. And who so humble as your old Greek friend? Commoner stuff you'll be hard put to find. A paste and clay cup, that's what they used for the planchette. A gifted rich boy. A lazy hand, that's David. Us, what? Mystical? God preserve us, never. We are telephone and wires. The element of talk, and lay no claim to nothing else, for everyone may lay claim to God. I felt that, DJ agreed. But what should they say when people ask if it's real? JM had his answer. I want the experience to be believed, and beyond that, it's up to the reader. DJ proposed that the poem is a glass, something to see through. The board says back to him, that, yes, hand, and poet, yes, that. No matter the means of what's called revelation, if the revelation is relevant. In November 1982, shortly before The Changing Light at Sandover went to press, Merrill visited Claude Fredericks in Paulet, Vermont, tiny village in the mountains. In the car was a carton containing about 20 reams of Ouija board transcripts he had used to write the trilogy. He intended to burn them. Most, though not all, of the transcripts from the second and third parts of the trilogy in Claude's fireplace. For this poet who archived every draft of every poem he wrote, this was a surprising thing to do. He had thought about it at least since writing the first book, when he imagines the elate burst of satori that a page of Ouija transcript would feel when put to the flames. Now, with Claude, a practicing Buddhist for audience, he carried out the final ceremony of Sandover. The bare stage set of his old friend's living room appealed to him with its white walls without paintings, windows without curtains, only a piano, a Norfolk Island pine, canvas chairs, and the great roaring hearth. By destroying so many of the Sandover transcripts, Merrill covered his tracks, preventing biographers and rare book dealers, the skeptical and curious, from laying hands on them. It was like someone burning old love letters, a way of keeping faith with those who had favored him. But he must have also wanted to let those pages go, to be free of them, unable to make anything more of them. He was Prospero, drowning his book. Page by page, into the Vermont night, the words of the spirits flew up the chimney as smoke. Well, Merrill died in 1995 of a heart attack, but that's not the whole story. He had been living with HIV for 9 years, during which he had concealed his diagnosis. What to make of Sandover? Well, that was a hard question. But what to make of Merrill's silence about his AIDS diagnosis? That was hard and important in another way. I had to find some way to narrate his intimate struggle with little concrete evidence. I had to understand, and to that extent, accept and come to terms with his decision to be silent about it. Or rather, I had to learn the language in which he spoke of it and wrote about it. What I want to read now are pages that recall Merrill's journey to the Mayo Clinic to be treated for HIV, or rather to be tested for HIV, since he doesn't know that he's infected, in March 1986. As you'll see, I'm drawing here in his private diary, and I'm also talking about how he used that diary at this moment of personal crisis, but also generally, typically, throughout his writing life. So I'll be quoting from it. Merrill boarded a plane to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, by himself. And you have to keep in mind, too, that he never went anywhere alone. He opened a new notebook and wrote on the first page, March 30, Easter. Now begin, on the plane to Rochester. 3 or 4 days alone. I feel almost piously toward them, a retreat from which I shall emerge either saved or not. The next day, he wrote, March 31st, 10. In the coffee shop after a restless night, then 8 o'clock appointment with Dr. Dixon. Nice man. Didn't seem too alarmed by anything despite my obliging diarrhea and weight loss. After examination, I went for bloodletting. The nurse called the man ahead of me by name, Joseph K. Very Kafka, in this world of underground corridors and color-coded areas. They must have taken a full cup of blood and made me dispose of my bandage 10 minutes later in a sanitary bag for that purpose. No one else had to do this. An hour later, he started a new page. 11:15, down to Epsom salts, phoned DJ. John Ciardi dropped dead yesterday. Ciardi was a poet and Merrill's friend in Key West. Merrill looked about him and saw a Midwestern town, drawn, he says, with a ruler by a careful 12-year-old. Streets and sidewalks extra wide, chain stores, adult and books, restaurants, gift shops sold teddy bears wearing intern smocks, flowers, jewelry, souvenirs from around the world for the sick to give their loved ones, for the latter to give and be absolved by. One looks for terminal signs in the corridors. The next morning, April 1st, he had an appointment with the proctologist at 7:45. He wouldn't hear the results of the previous day's blood work until 2. He waited. Pace of an ocean crossing. Many couples, unlike a hospital. The second honeymoon. Dressed without flair, all but a few, like people on long trips. One of the smart ones, a man, has a wandering 9-inch scar on the back of his skull. The day was almost over when he fit one more line on the page. 4:15, consultation over. Pending tests, the answer is ARC. The National Cancer Institute patented a test for antibodies to the AIDS virus in 1985. But testing was controversial for medical, legal, and ethical reasons, and the test had only recently become widely available in New York City. For an authoritative diagnosis, a friend had recommended the Mayo Clinic to Merrill. The answer that he got, ARC, was short for AIDS-related complex. This was a new diagnostic category indicating exposure to the virus and the presence of AIDS-associated symptoms. It was understood as a stage on the way to the development of so-called full-blown AIDS. With his notebook open, Merrill took in implications of the diagnosis. Virus is present in blood and semen, also saliva. Presume I am a carrier. And he continues. Merrill noted all of this carefully without further comment. Then he begins writing rhymed haiku verses in his notebook. Cut to clinic. These doomed people turn mild, polite, almost Japanese. He was observing how other patients behaved and asking how he should. Manners. He had put so much faith in them. Could they serve him now? On the next page, get through the stages, ever grislier, because that's how it's done. Why? Because that's how it's done. There was suddenly a great deal to manage, and he had to keep his head. Telling Peter Hooton, his lover, came first. He practiced a speech. I will not insult you by observing that you are free to leave me, that we are free to leave one another. There's no way of knowing whether this condition comes to me from you, or should your test be positive, vice versa. I am content to leave it at that, or so I think. We may be in for some mutual recrimination, even though neither can be construed as guilty. He was right. He could never know the source of his infection. Since the 1950s, he had put up with, in fact, a long list of sexually transmitted infections. So it was no surprise that he had been exposed to this newest threat. And if Hooton was infected, as seemed likely to him, Merrill might well be the source of his infection. He could hardly blame Peter, even if he could have, it would hardly have helped. What, then, would it mean for their relationship? Merrill's fear that Hooton would leave him was real, especially in view of Peter's intense anger at him that winter. But the virus would bind them together rather than drive them apart. Time was short, maybe very short, and Merrill had to start imagining the world without him in it. Pending tests, the answer is ARC. That sentence, written in his notebook, is the closest that Merrill ever came to stating explicitly that, in writing, that he was infected with HIV. Besides Hooton, he informed Jackson, his friend and psychiatrist Tom Detry, and his lawyer, Milton Moore. But it'd be years before he told anyone else. He approved of his friend David Calstone's choice not to speak about his diagnosis except to close friends. Keeping it private had enabled DK to live as he pleased without agonizing expressions of sympathy. Merrill, too, wanted to live and work as he pleased for as long as he could. James didn't want to be treated like a sick person, Hooton confirms. But he must have also had other motives for his silence. Undoubtedly, he wanted to protect his mother from learning of his condition, and to protect himself from the consequences if she did learn of it. The shame she would feel, the pain and worry, not to mention the vindication she might claim in their long battle over his sexuality. For that matter, like his mother, he prized his fame. He hardly wanted to see it collapse into notoriety. To become ill with HIV was to begin to lose control. And to make that illness public would be to lose one of the only forms of control left to him. Also, he wanted to protect Hooton. Public knowledge of Merrill's diagnosis would expose Hooton to speculation, and there were those who would blame Peter. And it was hard enough for an unemployed actor to find a job without having to fight this new bias. Finally, it was just possible, if Merrill could keep the fact of his illness from other people, that he might keep it on a good day from himself. Silence might seem to have been an easy course for him, or even a cowardly one. But it meant he would suffer from AIDS with little company or emotional and practical support. Silence would be a lonely discipline. Moreover, the moral pressure to speak about his condition would grow as the epidemic progressed, making his preference for silence a controversial position to maintain. In 1987, a year after his diagnosis, activists in New York formed ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power. The group's strategy was to use civil disobedience to force government and business to recognize the crisis, make drugs available to people with AIDS, and establish a coordinated national policy for dealing with the epidemic. The first of ACT UP's many protests leading to arrests and national news coverage took place on Wall Street, close to Merrill Lynch headquarters. The group chose for its symbol the pink triangle the Nazis used to mark homosexual prisoners in the death camps, but turned upward to signal empowerment. Political rage was never Merrill's way. To say you had AIDS was a political move, his friend Donald Ritchie comments, and Jimmy didn't like political moves. Even so, he was aware of those protests, and he must have felt personally addressed by ACT UP's haunting slogan, "Silence equals death." The question of whether or not to speak about his illness, however, had already been decided in 1986 by the solitude in which he traveled to the Mayo Clinic. This man who so disliked going anywhere alone. It left him with another question. How would he, an autobiographical poet, write about his illness? For even as he determined to remain silent about his HIV, he would have to write about it, as he wrote about everything else. Not to have done so would have been a massive concession, a sacrifice of his powers, and death in advance. Indeed, the chance to write about it, to write about it in his own way, was ultimately what he was keeping silent for. It wouldn't be easy. He would have to learn how to do it, starting, as usual, with what he wrote in his notebook. Well, I'm going to stop in a moment. I'm aware of how little of this book I have sampled. Not only large swaths of it, but Merrill's childhood, well, we haven't really got there. Greece, this is a huge topic. I think this is a funny book. There's a lot of funny in it, and I haven't really played that up. Trust me. Having read, however, the first paragraphs of the book, I'll read the last ones, and then you can have the effect of having read the whole thing, right? and as if you're falling asleep, you may be kind of alarmed to think you've finally gotten to the end of it. So here's the end of the book. It's going to also give me a chance to talk about a poem, which is something else that the book does a lot of, and is in some sense the whole point of the book. I'm talking about Merrill's final book. Like all his work, Merrill's A Scattering of Salts, his last book, demonstrates a fundamental fascination with and joy in language. Also, a faith in words as a supreme medium of individual expression and collective wisdom, both. To command them, which is to be ready and able to respond to their commands, hints, and promptings, is a high calling. This idealization, furthermore, is in no way naive. Language, Merrill's poetry knows, is suffused with human history, and our words are just as material, if not quite so vulnerable, as our bodies. The latter idea is the theme of the shortest, but also one of the most moving poems in the book. It's a poem written while Merrill was very sick. The title is, not the word, but the letters that make up the word, B-O-D-Y. Look closely at the letters. Can you see, entering stage right, then floating full, then heading off so soon, how like a little coal-rimmed moon, O plots her course from B to D, as Y, unanswered, knocks at the stage door. Looked at too long, words fail, phase out. Ask, now that body shines no longer, by what light you learn these lines and what the B and D stood for. Reversing the magic of the Ouija board, where on the Ouija board, one letter at a time links to another to create a word. Here, Merrill takes a word apart, letter by letter, to see what he can make of it. He points out that at the center of the word body is the vowel O. It rolls through B and D from birth to death as quickly as the moon crosses the evening sky. Those two consonants, B and D, mirrors facing each other, together create a stage, the space in which O's brief performance takes place. Just so, the soul animates the body for a time. Why? That nagging why knocks off stage. It seems to be asking, what on earth was it all about? What does the will to write poetry, to cry oh, like all the poets of the past, amount to? What did the soul have to say? At the end of the line, the quest for meaning, exemplified in a little poem like this, or in the grand designs of a life devoted to poetry, loses meaning. Words, like the body, phase out. They last only so long as the light that we need to read them. That truth leaves us with an enigma, with the question of what the B and D stood for. It's a question we all need to ask, and the subject of every biography. And now the book is over. You finished it. But I'm sure you have some questions and comments, and I hope to hear them. There's one upstairs. Yes?
I grew up in Stonington as one of Jeannie Merrill's summer people, but I was friends with Daniel Morse, the son of Robert and Isabel. And at some point, I think in the late 80s or 90s, I saw Jimmy on the street, and he'd just written a poem that included a reference to the local grocery store. And a reference, I believe, to a mouse or a rat that he'd seen in the grocery store at times. And I said, Jimmy, your poems created quite a stir in the village. He said, yes, yes, Robin, which was my name when I was young. Yes, yes, Robin, I've decided to go back to the indecipherable.
Yeah.
A sense of humor.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that?
You referred to the poem called November Ode, which was published in October before Ronald Reagan's second election, and it was meant to, as Merrill described it, describe the state of the nation, or at least his corner of it. And this was a quite lively local scandal. The mouse in the grocery that you mentioned, as well as the unflattering description of the clerk. After which, Merrill said, and poetry makes nothing happen. And your line back to indecipherability for me, he puts that in lots of letters. So this is, he's a remarkably funny man. One thing you'd want to say about it as you learn more about him is that he was always practicing. There he was trying his line out on you, and he's got it in postcards and letters, and it might find its way into a poem too. Why James Merrill? He's a master poet to begin with, so getting to work on him, in my business, that's lucky. That's really lucky. But moreover, I am someone who has always been interested in biography and in the relation between lives and work. Between the way we live and what we do with it. And this is, above all, Merrill's subject. And I can't think of another writer whose relations between life and work or life and art are as intricate and vital and compelling over and over again. That's a no-brainer. It was a great opportunity for which I'm extremely grateful. Yeah, Bruce.
A question I've asked before, but I'd like to share the reply, which is, why did you choose the photograph of this unformed youth instead of a poet of maturity and accomplishment?
Could you hear the question? The question is, why did I choose that lousy photo for the cover? No. Bruce is asking, Bruce Merrill, James Merrill's nephew, is asking, why did I choose a photo of the very young James Merrill, a 24-year-old man, on his second trip to Europe, first trip to Greece, for cover, rather than what you see on the frontispiece of the book, which is a poet who is kind of in apparent easy mastery of his experience and deeply accomplished. And the fact is that I wanted an image that everyone didn't know already. I also find that young person exciting. I am moved by his combination of pretension and vulnerability, and his ambition, and the sense that he has a whole big life and a great deal of art out in front of him, and that's what I wanted to, in some sense, capture as a theme in the book, because I really wanted to grasp his life as an adventure, and there he is, starting it. How's that, Bruce? I may not have convinced you yet, but anyway, but that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
I'm one of the fellows here at the James Merrill
Yes.
House, and you read from the second canto of the Ephraim book the description of the setting of the seances. But could you say something more about the relevance of the house in the poems, like from Water Street to Inner Room, etc.?
Yeah.
Being there, there is so much of it in the work.
James Merrill's relation to houses in general, from the house he was born into that was destroyed by a Weatherman bomb on West 10th Street, in a photograph you may have seen in the Times Book Review last week, to the extraordinary home in Southampton of his parents called the Orchard. He was programmed to respond to interior spaces as complex, full of possibility, and so he did absorb this idea. And throughout his life, he is a writer who positions himself in his home, like Emily Dickinson, for example. Not out on the street necessarily. His kind of poem from his book Water Street and Urban Convalescence begins where he's out on the street alone, cold in New York, and then he moves inside the house, inside his apartment, and he kind of regains his composure. He also, at the same time, moves into rhyme and meter. And Merrill is always playing upon you are Italian, the Italian for stanza, the sense that poetic forms are themselves architectural and contain rooms and surprising staircases and basements, maybe, towers. So throughout his life and throughout his work, there's a kind of complex analogy going on between writing and the lived spaces he inhabits, and none more so than, and none more fully kind of crafted and lived in and imagined and absorbed and reacted to than 107 Water Street. Mm-hmm.
I haven't read your book yet, but I have read A Different Person.
Yes.
I'm wondering if, having read it, would I find that your book complements it, or that your book would be sort of a surprise, taking a different point of view than he took?
A Different Person is James Merrill's memoir, his only memoir in prose, and it takes his years in Italy as the story he's telling, and then he very cleverly, in a device that he took from his friend Mary McCarthy, ends each chapter with a italic passage where he kind of jumps into the present and kind of talks about the story he's telling and looks forward and backward in time and really fits in almost anything he wants to say. It's a wonderfully formed narrative, and it's a marvelous book, which I really love. My book uses it and doesn't necessarily argue with it. I do point out the ways in which Merrill, seeks a kind of happy resolution to various kinds of conflicts, and this involves a certain amount of fibbing and artifice in the book. But it's something I deeply admire, and I did have to write my chapter about that period maybe 4 times. It's a little hard to compete with his book, but I hope I've found a way to do it. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if in your book or otherwise have thoughts about why James Merrill decided to keep his HIV infection and so on related problems private at a time when ACTO, as you mentioned, was starting to advocate for gay people with this disease a lot more, and
Mm-hmm. It's the anniversary last year.
Yeah, very good film about that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
Any thoughts about why James Merrill didn't join that movement and instead?
Well, I did give you probably my best 2 pages on that topic, but we can talk later. No, I guess actually, you know what, the poems like body is itself a kind of powerful answer to that, because I really think that he did keep the kind of public silence that he did in order to be able to write, which was the most important thing in his life. And to be able to write about AIDS and other topics with a kind of freedom which he might not have had otherwise, as well as a kind of sense that the public language of discussion of AIDS was deplorable and something that he shunned. But moreover, he didn't join really any movements, and he made a point of that, I suppose, and that's as part of being the aesthete that he was. That's the aesthete's position, is not to take positions, etc. Yeah. Not to sign petitions. So, yeah. Well, we've been talking for a while, and I'm eager to talk to more of you individually, and I bet you would like to have a reception as well. So before it gets later, let me thank you and look forward to more conversation.